lectures 1 and 2 for Dr. Shadmir, he kind of covered a little bit of each of the 3 components of the motor commands in the brain, then some stuff about spinal cord physiology, and then some stuff about muscles. So that's kind of what we'll go through today for lectures 1 and 2. Within motor commands, you kind of have to understand the model that he lays out. We'll talk about that, but that's sort of the most important part of that model is talking about rewards and costs. For muscle physiology, you really have to understand what the cross-section of a spine is, sort of reading what the different components of the cross-section of a spine are, and what happens during spinal injury. And then for muscles, you kind of have to understand the difference between extrafusal and intrafusal muscle fibers, as well as the afferent and efferent nerve fibers that innervate those muscles. So to start off, we'll talk about the motor commands in the brain. So when I talk about the model, this is really the model that that he presents for how you make decisions in the brain regarding motor commands. So goal specification essentially just refers to, hey, I want to move my hand to the left. That's a goal. And so you've specified a goal, that your brain has specified a goal. Next, what happens is that it needs to go into a motor command generator. And so motor command generator is basically just an area where you're essentially just deciding the rewards and the costs. So you're doing a cost-benefit analysis of, is this decision, is this goal, or is this movement a good movement? Is it beneficial to me, or is it too costly to me? And then if it is a beneficial movement in the cost-benefit analysis, it then moves to body and environment. So that means the movement has actually taken place. And then because the movement has taken place, there's some kind of state change. So maybe I was standing here. The movement that I decided to make was standing over here. Then this movement is now resulted in a state change where I'm now standing here instead of there. So that's what a state change refers to. And then as a result of that state change, you might have some sort of sensory consequence. So maybe the state change that I sort of decided to do, so maybe a movement that I decided to do was to place my hand over here. As a result of this state change, I'm now feeling pressure. As I'm applying pressure onto the wood, I'm also feeling pressure back from it. And so that's the sensory consequence. And so that is, in a sense, goes back to, as a result of having had that sensory consequence, it then goes back to the brain and potentially leads to maybe another movement. Something else that's also an important part of the model is, let me get the pointer up, is the forward model. And this is essentially just the idea that once you've generated a command, a motor command, you also generate a copy, you send a copy of that motor command to the forward model to predict what the sensory consequence would be. And so whatever sensory consequence you get, ideally you should have previously predicted that it was going to happen. And so you know what to expect when you make a certain movement, which is kind of intuitive. Okay, so that's a general model of the motor commands in the brain. Now we'll focus in on the motor command generator, so talking about costs and rewards. An experiment that showed that costs and rewards influence our actions is basically this experiment wherein a person was told to fixate, was told to sort of when the screen was not shown and then all of a sudden the screen was shown, the green circle was shown, they were told to fixate anywhere within the green circle and they would get plus 100 points. And then they added in this condition of, okay, what if there's also a red circle, wherein if you end up anywhere either on the red circle or in the overlap between the red and the green circle, you get minus 200 points. So this is almost like a cost now. And what you sort of see as a result of adding this cost, so going from this condition to going to this condition, you sort of see that people tend to fixate towards the right to avoid the cost. And so they want to maximize their benefit. And you kind of see the same thing here, wherein if you increase the cost even more, then people will try even more to avoid that cost and move towards benefit. And then this experiment right here basically is the same experiment, only that now there's increased variance, and so the chances of making an error, so you're trying to fixate here, but the chances of making an error are sort of greater, and so that's why these points are more dispersed. And so if you were to sort of have a more errorful sort of fixation, then you would move even more towards the right to try and avoid the cost of landing in the red circle. And so that's why this point is even further out than it was over here. And so that's just what this experiment is showing, and essentially it's just demonstrating that costs and rewards do influence our actions. Okay, so now we talk about specifically rewards. So how do rewards influence our actions? What is the regulator for that? The regulator for that is dopamine. And so dopamine is basically just a neurotransmitter. What you have in this experiment right here, which shows that dopamine is what's influencing rewards, is basically this kind of experiment where the x-axis here is just time. So over time, the experiment carries on. And then you have at a certain time interval x, you have some kind of stimulus being turned on. And then at some other later time point, you have some kind of reward for that stimulus having been turned on. And so and the p that you see here is basically the probability of receiving that reward. So going from p is equals 0.25, wherein the dopamine, so the y-axis here is basically just the activity of dopaminergic cells, and so how much dopamine you're releasing. And so you see that when there's sort of a very low probability of getting a reward, you tend to only get dopamine after you've gotten the reward. As opposed to the condition where p is equal to 1, so you're definitely getting a reward at this time point. In that case, the dopamine is released before. So as soon as the stimulus is turned on, you tend to get dopamine in your brain. And so what that essentially just shows is that dopamine fired when expecting reward. And so essentially here, if you were to substitute the stimulus on with instead something like motor action, so it's essentially just saying that if you were to have at x is equal to 10 seconds, if you were to have a certain motor action, and you know that this motor action at x is equal to 15 seconds is going to be really beneficial to you, you're going to get some kind of reward from it, then before you've even received that reward, dopamine is going to be sort of released in your brain, because it's expecting a reward. So that's just basically what dopamine does. It's a reward expectancy regulator. Questions? Yes?
So in Shadmir's lecture notes, he mentions that there's some dopamine-mediated on-coding of rewards that are greater than expected. Is that distinct from this, or are both true?
Say that again. So you have dopamine in...
It's like dopamine basically on-codes rewards that are greater than expected. Is that the same as this concept, or is it another thing that dopamine...
Greater than expected. Let me take a look at his notes. I don't want to comment on that in case, I'm not entirely sure. Let me look at that. Okay, so rewards influence actions through release of dopamine. Moving forward, so where in the brain does this happen? Where in the brain do you calculate whether or not this motor command is going to be rewarding to you? So basically, there are 3 pathways for dopaminergic cells. One of them goes to the basal ganglia, another goes to the hippocampus, and another goes to prefrontal cortex. For the purposes of this class, we're focused on the basal ganglia and the hippocampus. And we're going to talk next about the difference between the rewards that are associated with each of these areas. So for basal ganglia, the reward is associated with a stimulus, regardless of its spatial location. And with hippocampus, the reward is associated with location on a spatial map. And so this is a great experiment to sort of understand what that means. Essentially, you just have this bucket of water, and you've placed a mouse in it. And there's this little platform right there in the top left quadrant. This mouse has, after a certain number of tries of trying to find a good place to be at because it doesn't want to be in the water, has sort of realized that there is a platform there. And this platform is sort of next to the triangle. And so now it's sort of associated the triangle with the platform. So it knows that if I make a motor command, or if I make a motor action, a movement towards the top left quadrant onto that platform, that's rewarding to me. And so since that platform, it's now associated with the triangle. So if I go towards the triangle, it's rewarding to me. That is essentially reward associated with location on spatial map. And so what we see is that in this sort of, if we were to sort of track how this mouse moves, it knows to go to the top left quadrant because it's expecting reward there. And that's because of dopamine. So it knows that if I make this command, I'll get the dopamine sort of indicates that there's going to be expected reward. Now, if you had mutant mice which sort of don't have dopamine in their brain, they would just sort of swim around in sort of this haphazard pattern and wouldn't necessarily go straight towards the top left quadrant, which kind of shows that dopamine is the one that is the regulator of that expected reward. And so essentially the idea behind this is just that reward associated with location on spatial map is sort of encoded in the hippocampus. So in this, I apologize, I made a small mistake. These mutant mice don't lack dopamine. These mutant mice have a lesion in the hippocampus. Yeah, they have a lesion in the hippocampus. That's the reason why they're not able to associate the triangle with reward. So with this experiment, you essentially have a mouse that's been dropped into water. And there are two platforms. One is this green platform, one is the gray platform. However, the gray platform is too small for the mouse to stand on. And so it preferentially would want to go towards the green platform because that's where it'll get reward. That's where it'll be able to stand up and not be in the water anymore. And so what you see is that in the condition where you've lesioned the basal ganglia, so the caudate, you kind of seem to get more errors. That's basically just what this graph is showing. And so it's kind of showing the same thing as the other experiment, wherein if you lesion the caudate, this mouse is not able to find the platform. Or it has a lot more errors in finding the platform. And so what that shows is that there's a real they're completely injured, maybe even some of your white matter is injured. In that kind of scenario, you're essentially going to have paralysis or loss of control over pretty much all of the areas of your body that are below the vertebral dislocation level. Any questions about this? Is that clear? Oh. Yes.
Did you mention that, sorry, maybe I missed it. Is it possible to recover, like if there's only a little bit of damage, can the body recover to have full function again? Like can you like regrow some of that stuff, some of that tissue, like nervous tissue?
Neurons, technically, the spinal cord does not have, I'm not an expert in this, but to my knowledge, the spinal cord does not have good regenerative capacity. What I'm going to talk about on the next slide kind of confirms that or kind of demonstrates that. So I'm going to lean on the side of saying no, it does not. But I would still, I wouldn't, yeah, that's not a definite answer because I'm not 100% sure. Yeah.
So say my T12 or like T6 for everybody gets messed up.
Yeah.
Like would like my entire thoracic section get effed up, or would it just be like the T6?
It would just be the T6 if you have minimal sort of if you don't have a very severe injury, then just go with T6. In reality, it matters how many of these you lose, and it's not kind of like a binary decision. But the way that he sort of talks about it in class, he sort of wants to simplify it down to binary, like a little bit of damage versus a lot of damage. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, moving forward. Okay, so now we talk about on a more cellular level what happens in spinal injury. And this is kind of important. Easy test questions. What is the chain of events after the spinal injury? You have healthy neurons after spinal injury as well as injured neurons. So let's talk about the injured neurons first. Injured neurons basically will release a flood of glutamate, and glutamate is basically an excitatory neurotransmitter that neurons tend to release. But as a result of injury, they release a flood of it, so too much of it. And that tends to overexcite their neighboring neurons. And as a result of that, those neighboring neurons might die. The process of dying by overexcitation is called excitotoxicity. Another thing that happens as a result of releasing this flood of glutamate is the fact that the glial cells die as a result of it. Glial cells are basically just support cells, which I forget the exact function. But yes, they just support. I'll have to look that up. It's important to know the function of glial cells. They make myelin. Okay, they make myelin. And so you kind of need the glial cells for proper functioning because without the myelin, you have abnormal conduction of that action potential. And if you have abnormal conduction of action potential, those neurons are not helpful to you. Yeah. So that's kind of one of the downstream effects of having those injured neurons. Now, alternatively, what happens to the healthy neurons? How are they impacted? So they're impacted as a result of the broken vessels that hemorrhage in the gray matter. And so these broken vessels essentially lead to, since they're hemorrhaging, blood's coming all the way out, there's a fluid-filled region called a cyst that forms, which leads to swelling. And this kind of swelling puts pressure on both axons as well as vessels. And so the axons are affected as well as healthy intact vessels are affected. When healthy intact vessels are affected and constricted as a result of this swelling and pressure, there's prevented O2 delivery to the healthy neurons. And so the healthy neurons also die. And so this is kind of the chain of events that takes place after a spinal injury. So you want to know what happens as a result of the injured neurons as well as what happens to the healthy neurons, which in effect become injured. Over time, a wall of glial cells forms around the cyst and prevents regrowth of the severed axons. And so that's going back to your question of whether or not they regenerate. That's why I'm leaning on the side of saying they don't, because a wall of glial cells sort of prevent that regeneration from taking place. Any questions about this? Yes?
Is that wall of glial cells, are they dead glial cells? Because like I see you're at that.
So they're not dead glial cells. So this is kind of the immediate chain of what happens like immediately after the spinal injury. So yes, there are a lot of glial cells dying, but over the long term, you have
light glial cells that just sort of come in and form sort of a wall around that system, prevent any other degenerative immune system to react. Any other questions? Don't. I know that's in the lecture notes. Yeah. Okay, so now we talk about muscles. So for muscles, we have, this is just a bunch of terminology that you kind of need to know. Muscles are made of muscle fibers. Each muscle fiber is made of muscle myofibrils. Each myofibril has filaments. Each filament has sarcomeres, and each sarcomere has actin and myosin. Motor neuron, basically just a neuron innervating a muscle. You have neuromuscular junction, basically just the synapse between the neuron and the muscle. Acetylcholine excitatory neurotransmitter for the muscle. This is kind of important terminology because it can get kind of confusing, the difference between a motor unit and a motor pool. So a motor unit is one motor neuron plus all the muscle fibers that it innervates, and a motor pool is one muscle and all the motor neurons innervating it. So just kind of keep that terminology separate. The size of a motor unit determines how fine the motor control is. And so if you have sort of one motor neuron innervating only one muscle fiber, and then the next muscle fiber is controlled by another motor neuron, that's very, very fine control, because you can sort of control that very tiny area independent of each other, as opposed to the kind of situation where, you know, 5 of those muscle fibers are being controlled by one motor neuron, and so you kind of can't choose to maybe contract one muscle fiber but not another, because all 5 of them are being controlled by the same motor neuron. So that's a gross move and not a fine movement. Questions? It's just the excitatory neurotransmitter that a motor neuron would release to excite a muscle fiber. Any other questions? Okay, forward. Okay, so now we have the muscle fibers themselves. So the muscle fibers that we typically learn about in SB1, the ones that sort of generate force are the extrafusal muscle fibers, and so that's sort of this guy right here, sort of this guy. And then within the extrafusal muscle fiber, you kind of have this sort of fluid-filled space or spindle. So you kind of have the muscle spindle just in that sort of opening right there. And within the muscle spindle, you have multiple intrafusal muscle fibers. And so extrafusal muscle fibers connect to tendons. Their role is to produce force, and they're innervated by alpha motor neurons. As opposed to that, you have intrafusal muscle fibers that lie within the muscle spindle. They connect to the extrafusal muscle fiber, and their role is sensory. And so they detect stretch. So they detect stretch of the extrafusal muscle fiber. They're contained within, so this is written wrong, I'll have to fix that, but they're contained within the muscle spindles, and sort of the extrafusal muscle fibers are innervated by muscle spindle afferents. The reason that they're innervated by muscle spindle afferents is because they're sensory in nature. If they're sensory, then they're collecting information about the stretch of the extrafusal muscle fiber, and they're sending it towards the spinal cord and then towards the brain. And so they're afferent. And then you also have the intrafusal muscle fibers being innervated by gamma motor neurons. Okay, so I don't want to do this with chalk. Let's do that. I'm just going to talk through it, but you guys should make sure to pay attention to this, because I'm going to try and distinguish the difference between some of these clearer. Okay, so motor fibers, the alpha motor fibers that innervate the extrafusal muscle fibers, those are efferent motor neurons. And so essentially those are the motor neurons, the alpha motor neurons, they go to the extrafusal muscle fiber and allow for contraction of that muscle fiber to generate force. So those are, alpha motor neurons are efferent in nature. And then you also have these gamma motor neurons that innervate the intrafusal muscle fiber. These are also efferent in nature, which they're not so helpful for force generation, because even though they do send signals, efferent signals to the intrafusal muscle fiber, they only help with maintaining muscle tone. They don't help with generating substantial amount of force. So you kind of want to keep that difference between the gamma efferent motor neurons, which innervate the intrafusal muscle fiber, versus the alpha motor neurons, which innervate the extrafusal muscle fiber. So the fact that the alpha motor neurons are the ones that are responsible for, they go to the extrafusal muscle fiber and are responsible for the majority of that force generation. And then you have, you actually have 3 types of afferents that come from the muscle. 2 of them come from the intrafusal muscles. So those are the type 2 and the type 1A. Both of these detect stretch. And since they're detecting some kind of sensory feedback and they're sending it to the brain, they're afferent to nature. A third one that's not mentioned here, but is mentioned more in lecture 3, but I just wanted to bring it up since it's relevant to this concept. A third one is it's type 1B. Type 1B sensory afferent. So type 1B afferent, which actually connects, sort of, it's an afferent that originates from the Golgi tendon organ. And so the Golgi tendon organ basically just sits at the connection between the extrafusal muscle fiber and the tendon. And so just between the extrafusal muscle fiber and the tendon, you kind of have the Golgi tendon organ. And so from there, you also have the sensory afferent that goes up to your brain, and that tells you information about the force that's being generated in your extrafusal muscle fiber. And so in a sense, just to conclude, we talked about 2 efferents. One is the gamma, which goes to the intrafusal. The other one is the alpha, which goes to the extrafusal. And the extrafusal is the one that's generating a lot of that force. And then we talked about 3 afferents, 2 of which just come straight from the intrafusal up to your brain and tell us about what is the change in stretch. And then the third one comes from the Golgi tendon organ and tells us about the force that's been generated in that extrafusal muscle fiber. Any questions? Yes?
So for each individual muscle fiber, it has both the afferent and efferent components?
Yes.
So the diagram there is showing muscle fibers with connections to, I get, what's the difference between an extrafusal muscle fiber and intrafusal muscle fiber? Are they the same fiber?
No. They're different. So the idea is that this region right here, this is extrafusal. So the one that's around. And then this right here, this thing that is basically just this opening, this is the muscle spindle, which contains various intrafusal muscle fibers. And so what you're seeing, these 2 guys right here, those are intrafusal muscle fibers. So they essentially connect to the extrafusal muscle fibers to detect what is the stretch and what is the stretch that's currently taking place in the extrafusal muscle fiber. And so they're sensing, they have a sensory role to sense what's happening in the extrafusal muscle fiber.
Okay, so intrafusal muscle fibers are exclusively contained in
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Any other questions? I know this is kind of confusing. Okay then. So we'll have lectures 3 and 4 now.
It's probably catching it all. Wait. Don't do that. What did I say?
So for career network is how the muscles type and also the muscles and also the your visual system cooperation with your motor system so that you can control your muscles and also breathe. So first rule, first thing is the muscle types proprioception and the reflex concepts. So there are different types of muscle fibers in the muscles. We have mainly three types. There is type 1, which is slow contraction fibers. So essentially, it is the fibers that if you give it a stimulus, it will contract very slowly with other muscles. There is also type 2 muscles, which is faster contracting fibers. And for those fibers, it will contract very fast. It also has two subtypes. It has the 2A and 2X. So for the 2A, it is sort of resistant to the fatigue. For 2X, it will get very easily fatigue. So here is a plot to show you how these three types of muscle fibers react to the stimulus. So on the type for the A panel here, it essentially we give it a small stimulus like the twitch, and then you can see this reaction of the three types of muscle fibers is different. For the slow one, it sort of like generate this reaction slower than the other two, and also the amplitude is slower. For the other two, it is sort of faster, especially for the type 2X. It will generate a very large response, and also it is very fast compared with the other two. So this one will be sort of in the middle. The B panel here essentially gives you a large stimulus, a titanic stimulation to the muscle fiber, and you can see for the slow contracting fibers, it will gradually generate a response. So gradually going up. For this two, it will go up very fast and also generate a much faster and also larger response compared with this one. However, the problem of these two muscle fibers is that it will get fatigued very easily. So you can see, especially for this one, the 2X, it will go down gradually. So this is the difference here. The panel C here is essentially a long duration stimulus. So it stimulates those muscle fibers continuously, and you can see that the slow contraction fibers will generate the same amount of force every time. But for the other two, it will first generate a large force. You can see this amplitude here is much larger than the first one, but it will gradually go down because it is easily to get fatigued, especially for this one, for the last one. So this is three types of motor unit and motor fibers. So for different kind of people, it's sort of like have different decompositions of these three types of muscle fibers. So for example, people who are actively athletic will have more slow fibers, slow contraction fibers, but for those like competitors, they will tend to have more fast fatigue fibers. So with use of your muscle fibers, it essentially will turn your fast fatigue muscle fibers to the slow type of fibers. So with more usage, you have more slow type fibers. Here is another thing to tell you that when you try to stimulate a muscle, a motor unit, because in this muscle you will have different type of fibers, and then the reaction or the response in time of these two different types of muscle fibers will be different. So here it tells you that we have two motor units. Motor unit one is a slow muscle fiber. So you can see this is its response. It's slow. It is a short, slow response, and also it has a shorter, lower amplitude. The motor unit 2 is a very large amplitude response. It is also very fast if you give it a stimulus. But in reality, if you do a stimulus
fibers will generate the force. So it is a time difference of these two type of fibers in a real movement, which will generate the force at different time. So besides these different types of fibers, we also have the sensory system in your muscles. So essentially, you will have two types of sensory organs in the muscles. You will have the muscle spindles and also the Golgi tendon. So the difference between these two is that the muscle spindles will be very sensitive to the length change of the muscle, and the Golgi tendon is sensitive to the force change of the muscle. So as you can see here, if I have a length change of the muscle here, so the muscle spindle response will have a peak here when you change the length of the muscle, but it will gradually go down when the length of the muscle doesn't change anymore. So for this one, the Golgi tendon is sensitive to the force. So if you have a force change in your muscle, you will see a change of the response of the Golgi tendon. Oh, the other thing is that the muscle spindle is mainly to excite your oculomotor neuron, and the Golgi tendon is mainly to inhibit your oculomotor neuron through a interneuron pathway. So there is like two different effects on your oculomotor neuron. Also, besides the oculomotor neuron, we also have the gamma motor neuron in the spinal cord. So the gamma motor neuron is used to control the sensitivity of the muscle spindles. So, for example, this is like a higher end control from your brain to your muscle. When I move my muscle, when I move my limb, sometimes I don't want it to be too sensitive. Then at this time, your brain will generate a signal to tell your gamma motor neuron that I don't want my muscle to be too sensitive. I just want it to like assist my movement. And then this time, the gamma motor neuron will control the sensitivity of the muscle spindle, and then so this is a control of your muscle sensitivity from the central nervous system from your brain. So together, you can see from this plot, this is your spinal cord. We have the oculomotor neuron here. So every time when we want to move your muscles, we have a signal going down from the brain to the spinal cord to the oculomotor neuron, and then the oculomotor neuron will generate the signal to innervate this muscle, and the muscle will contract. So when the muscle contracts, you will have two aberrant axons goes back to the spinal cord. The first one is the Golgi tendon, which will generate an inhibition through this interneuron to the oculomotor neuron. The other one is from the muscle spindle to the neuron that will generate another excitation axon to this oculomotor neuron. So this is like the electrical feedback pathway of your muscles in the movement. The other one, so here is a plot, and I said before that when you have a signal going to the oculomotor neuron and stimulate your muscles, you will have this two local pathways, the local feedback. But the other one is from the higher end from your brain, you will control your muscles through the gamma motor neurons. So it will control the sensitivity of the muscle spindles. So essentially from this diagram, you will see that you have both the local pathway, the local feedback, and also the central control from your brain to the oculomotor neuron. So this one is also similar to what I said before. We have two pathways. The one is lower here is the local one, and also we have a higher end control from the brain. The difference between these two will be that the lower one is sort of like a short latency pathway. So when you have a perturbation of your muscle, when you want to stretch it, so it will generate a response, and it will be very fast because it only goes through this local pathway. It does not have to go to your brain. So this will be a short latency pathway. However, if when the sensory information goes to your brain and your brain wants to control your muscle, wants to control the sensitivity of it, then this pathway is sort of like a long-lasting neuron. It will generate another response after this local response. So here is the sort of representation of the experiment for that point. So here we have a EMG plot for a biceps muscle, and then at this time you will see a stretch stimulus to a muscle. So the difference between these two plots is that as an experimenter, I will ask the subject or the participant either to oppose my stretch or to assist my stretch. So if I tell the subject to oppose my stretch, then you will see two responses after the stimulus. The first response is an involuntary response. It's sort of like a local pathway response. So that is going from the muscle spindle and Golgi tendon to the spinal cord and go directly to the autonomic neurons. That's the first response. However, after that, you will see another response. This one is the voluntary response, which is the response that when you stretch the muscle, it will generate a sensory information going to your brain and then coming back down to the spinal cord. And this one will generate this large voluntary response. So here I ask the participant to oppose my stretch, so it will generate this two response. However, if I ask him to assist my stretch, I don't want him to do anything, then at this time when you do a stimulus, it will only generate a involuntary response. It cannot help it. It's just a very small local response. But because in those steps you need to assist my stretch, you does not need to oppose it. So there is no other component, no this late latency response, no this voluntary response. So this is the two different EMG plots where you have like two different brain control of your movements. And he also talks about the descending tract from the brain to the spinal cord. So here is a plot of your brain and the spinal cord. So we have different kinds of descending tract to send information from the brain to the spinal cord. The most important one will be this cortical spinal tract. So it essentially gives the command of your links of your muscles about this spine movement. So it goes from the motor cortex, especially the frontal motor cortex, to the spinal cord to innervate the autonomic neurons, and then goes to your link. The other one is the cerebrospinal tract, which goes from the red nucleus in the midbrain and to control the upper limb or arm movement. We also have two reticular spinal tract, which is the coming from the reticular formation in the brainstem. So we have two types. One is the pontine reticular spinal tract, which comes from the pons. The other one is the medullary reticular spinal tract, comes from the medulla. We also have the vestibular spinal tract. So for this reticular spinal tract and the vestibular spinal tract, this is mainly not for movement, but for the balance control, the posture control of your body. So it will have some information from the reticular formation from your vestibular system to help you to know where your body is in the spatial corridor, so that it will help you to maintain balance and some coordination adjustment of your movement. But this is not an initiation of your movement. So for the cortical spinal tract, most of the spinal tract, like 90% of it, will cross the midline at the lower medulla, some places conturate. So for this 90%, your body and your right brain is controlling the left side of the body. There is also a small amount of the CST will not cross, and for this small amount, it will essentially controls the proximal muscles rather than your distal muscles. So this 90% is mainly for fine movement, like moving your fingers, but the 10% is only to help you to move the arm muscles, some proximal muscles. So like this experiment is a elaboration of that point. For example, I have a participant who has a split brain, which means that there are some places called corpus callosum in your brain to connect your right brain to the left brain. However, for this patient, it has this damage in the corpus callosum, so his left brain and right brain is sort of like completely separate. And at this time, I will put a stimulus at his right visual field. And so that when I have this right visual field, you can only see that in your left brain, in the left visual cortex. And this time, I will ask him to, when he sees this stimulus, try to move his arm. So if he sees this stimulus, he can move the arm move the arm very easily, so that you can. This is actually when he sees the stimulus, I will ask him to move the left arm. So you can see that the stimulus is only at the left hemisphere, and he can only sense it using. We know that the left hemisphere is only to control the right side of the body, the right arm. But I want him to sort of move his left arm. So at this time, because this 10% uncross the CST, he can still move the proximal arm muscles with his left hemisphere of his left arm, but he cannot move the finger muscles, not this fine movement with the left hemisphere. So this ipsilateral control is only for the proximal arm muscles, not for the fine movement, not for the distal muscles. We also have the reticular spinal tract. So the difference between the two reticular spinal tracts, the pontine one and the medullary one, is that the pontine one is actually will have a citationary synapses, a citation function to your leg and arm muscles. But for the medullary one, it is mainly for the inhibition. Together, these two reticular spinal tracts will help you to control the posture and the balance, and to help you to coordinate your movement. So this is another example of the split brain patient. As I said before, for this kind of patient, you will have a damage in the corpus callosum between the two hemispheres, so that your left and right brain will be completely separate. So information that goes into, for example, the information flows to the right visual field will only goes to the left side of the brain, but the information at the left visual field will goes only to the right hemisphere. These two hemispheres cannot talk to each other. So without this information exchange, you will see a lot of weird response of this patient. For example, he wants to grab something with his right hand, and then his left hand will do a very opposite response to his right hand. The other thing is that the language center, we know that is mainly in the left hemisphere for the right-handed person. So because this damage in the corpus callosum, because this separation between two hemispheres, if I only show the patient a stimulus in the right visual field, in the left visual field here, and then you can see the information of this stimulus will generate a response in his right hemisphere here, but because this separation, the left hemisphere doesn't know that we have the stimulus, and the language center cannot get this information. So if I put a spoon here at his left visual field, and I ask him if he see anything, and then he will say, I see nothing, because the left hemisphere just doesn't get this information. And the final one will be the cooperation between the visual system and the motor system. How do you, when you see a target, how do you move your hand to the target? So the main thing about this part is the posterior driver cortex neurons. So here is two different kind of visual screen, the dorsal one and the ventral one. The ventral one is more conventional one, which is just to let you know where is this target, where is this object in the visual field, let's see this target. However, the dorsal one, it is combined with the other information from our body, like the sensory info, the pre-parietal sensory X-ray information. So with this kind of information, we'll be able to know where this object is respect to my body. Not only in my visual field, but if it is left to my body or right to my body, it is in front of me or back of me. So how does our brain encode this kind of information? The most important thing here is that the cells in the visual cortex actually have this fixation center receptive field. So this receptive field is sort of like a relative field or relative coordination. So for example, I have the participant to fix his visual to this cross here, and then I have a receptor in his retina, and the receptive field for that neuron will be a circle here. And if I put a target in the receptive field, you can see the neuron will discharge. We'll get a response without this one. However, if I ask him to fix his vision to another point, this one, and then the receptive field will go together with this fixation point, and the relative position between the receptive field and the fixation point will remain the same. If I still have a target here and this old location, because it does not go into my receptive field anymore, then you cannot get a non-response. However, if I still have this receptive field and your fixation point here, but I move this target into your receptive field, the relative position of your target and your receptive field is the same as the first one, then you will generate a symmetric discharge. So when I ask you to point to the target, when I see it, here is the target, and then no matter where my head is looking at, my head is towards the left or towards the right, if you draw a line, then you will see that your eye, your retina, and your inner point and your target will always be on the same line. So you will essentially tend to align your fingers to this line between your fixation point and the eye. So here is an experiment about the reaching arrows. So here, this experiment is actually to tell you how our brain encodes this fixation and the target. Either this target is actually relatively to your fixation point or to your body position. So for this subject, we have a damage or a lesion in his right hemisphere, as you can see in the MRI image here. So when I see this damage, I will know that he actually will have more reaching arrows to the stimulus or to the target that was into his left hemisphere or left visual field, because the left visual field will send the information to your right hemisphere. So, for example, in the first part, when I ask the patient to fix his fixation point is here in the middle, and then I have two targets. One is at the right, one at the left, and the other one is at the right. And then the reaching arrow will be larger if the target is presented to the left visual field. However, if I don't know whether this difference in this reaching arrow is because of the target is left and right relatively to his fixation point, to his vision, or to his body position. So in the next experiment, I will ask the patient to look at different places to fix his vision to different fixation point. So for this one, I ask him to look at this fixation point to the left to the right of this panel, and then I will have target put here. So the target here is to the left of your fixation point, but to the right of your body. The other way to do this, on the next experiment, I will ask him to look at the fixation point that is to the most left of this panel, and then to put the target which is right to your fixation point, but left to the body. And then you can compare the reaching arrow between these two. So you can see that the target will generate a more reaching arrow when the target is actually left to the fixation point, but not have the true body. So we will know that how our brain encode this target is actually relatively to a fixation, which is a fixation center coordinate, but not with respect to our own body location. So here is how you, when you have a target, how is your finger point to this target. So here I have a target here, and I can look at this. This is my fixation point here, and then I look at this fixation point. I also have a target inside my visual field. I want to point to this target, but my hand is not in my visual field. So at this time, how can I point to this target without knowing where my hand is in my visual field? So what my body or what my brain will do is that I will have three kinds of information. The first one is where my arm is with respect to my own body, which is the arm position in the proprioception coordination. The other one is where my eye and my head is in this proprioceptive coordination. The third one is where my target is with respect to my retina. So for the first two information, we can generate the coordination in this fixation center location of your hand. And for the last two information together, we will be able to generate where the target is in this fixation center position or fixation center coordinate. So you sort of have the coordinate of the target and your hand at the same coordinate, their coordination at the same fixation center coordinates, so that you will be able to generate a difference of the vector between your target and your hand. And with this difference vector here, you will be able to know where your hand is here. So you can see the vector from the target to your fixation point is represent where your target is in this fixation coordinate. And this vector from your finger point to the fixation point is the vector that represents where your hand is, where your arm is in this fixation center coordinate. And you'll do a vector difference between these two vectors, and then you will get the vectors from your finger point to the target. And then your brain will know how to move your arm. So then there are some experiments about the neuronal response of this posterior parietal cortex, the PPC. So the neurons in PPC can encode a lot of information. The first one is the information about the target location, the image location, and your head position or your eye position. So in the part A, essentially, I will ask the monkey or the participant to look at a certain fixation point and move the image or the target around him. So we will see that the neuron will generate a large response when my target moves to a certain place in this coordinate. And for this one, it will generate a larger response when the target moves to this 20 minus 20 coordinate. For the B panel here, essentially is that if I ask him to move his fixation point to another place and then do the same target changing, move the target like in this new experiment, and then you will see that the neuron will generate a large response when your target with respect to this fixation point is at the same location as this one. So only as long as this relative difference between your fixation point and your target is the same, then the target will get, your neuron will generate the largest response. So it is all about this relative difference between your fixation point and your target. It is not relative to where the target is in the spatial coordinate. And the C panel here is essentially I will fix my target at certain location. As for this one, I will fix it here at 20 minus 20. And then I will ask the participant to move his fixation point and then look at the response of the neurons in PPC. So I will see a lot of response in changing his fixation point. For example, if I ask him to fix his fixation to minus 20, like this one, and then you can see that sort of like the fixation point is here and your target location at 20 minus 20, essentially it is the same location at the with your target, then it will generate almost no response. So this just tells you that the neurons in PDC can have encode a lot of information, not only the target neural fixation centered coordinates, but also where your head and eye is in the spatial coordinates. The other thing about your PDC neuron encoding is that you will have a gap when you look at different places when the precision point change. So here, for example, this one is a neural response when you change your location of the target. For example, the lower one is like a Gaussian over here. This one will generate a peak when you move the target to a certain position, like the Rx coordinate is almost zero. However, if you change your fixation point and also then move your target again, you can see the x-axis is the relative position of your target and your fixation point, and then you also generate a similar response. It will also have this peak at the same location, but the point is that your total response, the amplitude of your response will be different if you have this different fixation point. So different fixation points essentially will have different gain if you look at different points. This gain will be sort of linear. It will either going up or going down. So, for example, if I have my fixation point at coordinate 0, and we will have a discharge of the response when I move this target, and it will look like an option. And then if I move my fixation point to another place, and you know that this place has a gain of, let's say, 2 times of the original one, and then your Gaussian curve will have 2 times the amplitude will be different. So it is your gain multiply your original response, and then it will give you a new response. So this 4 panel here, the 4 part is the 4 different neurons, essentially have the same information. The neurons in the PPC will also be sensitive to the head position. So if I have my eye fixed at a certain point and target as and move the target, will have this response, but it will be different when my head is moving to the left or to the right. So and the final one will be that this neuron in the PPC is encodes the relative position between your head and your fixation point. So here is that I will ask this monkey, train this monkey to look at certain point at the black one, and ask him to move his hand to this black spot here, and then I will look at the response of the neurons in the PPC. So this is condition 1, I will see this response, and then I will move this 2 spot, the red one and the white one, to the right, and then ask him to do the same thing. And because this relative position between your hand and your fixation point is sort of the same, and then you will get a similar response. So all this kind of encoding of your neuron in the PDC is in the centered fixation center coordinate. So I think that's it. Any questions? This one?
Zero and fully refer to, is that saying that
You mean the x-axis or?
on the x-axis, yeah.
So x-axis is, you can see it's sort of like the relative coordinate between your target and your position point.
Okay, so having them both equal to 0 is saying that the target and the fixation point are the same point?
Yeah, for this neuron, yes.
Okay, so this is.
Yeah, but for like the neurons in the fourth panel there, the fourth one is different because the target has to be 40 in the x position to have the peak response.
And the top part is the response for what?
You mean this two curve different? It's just when you move your fixation point to another place, and then it will have a different gain from your response. So at my fixation point first is here, and I have this kind of response. And if I move my fixation point to the left of the original one, I will have the similar curve, but the amplitude will be different because my fixation point is different. So the shape will be the same for the relative, the relative position of the target. Like you move your target around.
So is it two curves with different triangles?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have a question from like a while back about the opening of the concepts. So like you said that it inhibits the alpha motor neurons
Yeah.
of the same muscle. But in section, Ananya said that it inhibits the motor neurons of a different muscle, like the extensor muscle versus like the flexor muscle that the spindle offers excite. So I'm like, is it like the different one or is it the same one? And maybe you can answer this.
It's the different muscle. I solved it out with her. Like, I mean, double check. So if you look at the diagram, I don't think, pull up the diagram where they have the meaning as well as, also just like the big picture diagram for this. Yeah, you have that in your slides. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah, so in this one, you have interneuron synapse inhibits motor neurons to so that's the second pathway that you're going through the interneuron. So that's going to sort of the opposite muscle. So if you want to contract, you need to a muscle, you need to inhibit the opposite muscle. So you have sort of an excitatory input going to sort of this muscle, and then you have inhibitory input going to the other muscle. So my guess is that what it says on that slide is an error. The slide that you talked about earlier. Where we sort of
The slide right there.
yeah,
This one.
Oh,
this one. Yeah, I think this is. I think this is an error. Alpha motor neurons of the same muscle. I think it's the opposite.
Or it might be it's sort of like two different muscle pathways and different situation.
Yeah, okay.
I just feel like for that situation, it probably is because you need to yeah, I would say it's for different muscle, different situation, different movement.
Yeah, basically,
For that one, yes. Any other questions?
I would say just try and understand what's happening in the so like in that knee example, in terms of how you have the agonist and the antagonist. That basically is just showing you that it has an inhibitory. So once you sort of send your you put this much reflex, you'll have an inhibitory and inflammatory input. Now the idea is that what is said on that slide, I report error. That's just a sequence that sort of is trying to say yes, you would have an inhibitory in addition to the cytokine. But in the context of the knee example, yeah, so you're trying to yeah. So that
But not his knees.
Just like T1 is this, T2 is this.
And there's some said like there's 3 pixels. Like this paragraph introducing that. And there's 3 pixels. Three.